Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another Babbling Irons match preview. It's Newcastle at home. It's a very, very difficult fixture, but it could come at maybe a slightly more convenient time for West Ham than Newcastle. Obviously, they've got their Carabao Cup final just a few days after our clash on Monday night. So, yeah, there's a few up and downs as to who's going to start. They've also got some injuries, suspensions that are going to miss some key players for this game. But West Ham have the injuries as well, which we're going to get into. And we're going to look at how Graham Potter can potentially make it 3 wins in a row in the Premier League for West Ham, which would be the first time this season. Obviously, going back-to-back wins in the Premier League was a first this season as well after West Ham beat Leicester. So if you enjoyed the breakdown, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel. And yeah, let's just look at the tail of the tape so far between these two teams and where they currently sit in the table and how they've both done in terms of the expected data versus the real data. So we'll start with the current positions. West Ham on 33 points to Newcastle's 44. 32 goals scored for West Ham to Newcastle's 46. 47 goals conceded to Newcastle's 38. And West Ham currently find themselves in 15th position when recording this, and Newcastle in 6th position. So when you look at that, there hasn't been a crazy difference between these two teams. I'd say they've both had pretty poor league campaigns. Obviously, Newcastle have got to a final of a cup. They're now starting to pick up a little bit momentum in the league. They definitely started slow. But when we look at the expected data as well, we can kind of see that both teams not doing great. So West Ham with expected points of 29.04, Newcastle 40.41. Expected goals scored for West Ham at 37.79 to Newcastle's 47.08. Expected goals conceded for West Ham 52.37, which is one of the highest in the league, and Newcastle at 41.36. And West Ham are expected to be in 16th rather than 15th, and Newcastle a few places below it in 10th rather than 6th. So the stats suggest that Newcastle have slightly overperformed in terms of where they currently are in the Premier League this season, as have West Ham by 1 place. So Newcastle a slightly more bigger discrepancy there. But when we look at, let's just take it back a minute, Newcastle United, where they've gone from 4 years ago to now, where they've had that takeover and the transition they've gone through, the iteration of Champions League football, all of this hype around them becoming one of the big players in the game again and competing with the likes of Man City, who haven't had the best of seasons themselves. But when we look at Newcastle on paper, they have a fantastic squad. They really do. When you look at it man for man and the types of quality they have in Isak, Bruno Guimaraes, Botman, Gordon, they have fantastic talent in their team. And it's no surprise that they should be pushing for Europe and pushing for, domestic success as well in the Carabao Cup and FA Cup. So when you assess Newcastle's season so far this season, it's weird because obviously we beat them at St James's Park in probably what was one of the most unexpected Julian Lopetegui wins we had under him, to beat them 2-0 as well. But when you look at Newcastle now, it's very, very difficult to pin how they're going to approach a game in terms of, we know how they're going to play, we know how they're going to set up, we know how Eddie Howe's going to approach it, but in terms of just how they're going to play on the day, they're a very up and down team this season, which is reflective in the data and the stats that we've seen, and definitely the league position they find themselves in. There hasn't been a array of quality in the Premier League this season. You've seen the likes of Bournemouth, you've seen the likes of Brighton, Forest. They're all having fantastic campaigns, but then you look at the likes of Spurs, United, even Newcastle in that category, I would say have underperformed this season, which has allowed that space for the likes of Bournemouth and Forest to capitalise on. I think Newcastle will be kicking themselves because I think this was a season they could definitely have got into Champions League football. They could still do that. They're not a million miles off of it. But I think now they've got that chance with the Carabao Cup final, to finally win a piece of silverware in so long. That's got to be the focus now. That's got to be the focus for Eddie Howe and his team. And it's not going to be easy with some of the injuries they have. But when we talk about this clash with West Ham, I think this comes at a pretty ideal time for West Ham because obviously they've almost got one eye on that final, Newcastle. And yes, they've still got ambitions in the Premier League, but as a player, you're going to have that in the back of your mind. We saw it with West Ham whenever there was a big European game, whether it be quarters, semi, final, whatever it was very rare we would follow it up with a really good performance in the Premier League. So look, that's a big thing to make. It's a big call to make there, but I do think that slightly plays into West Ham's favour. Obviously, it being a Monday night as well, you'd expect the atmosphere to be a little bit better inside the stadium than, say, a regular Saturday 3 o'clock. So there's a few things that are definitely going in West Ham's favour, but that's not to say that Newcastle don't have the quality to hurt West Ham and win this game, and they're obviously favourites going into this game. So let's take a look at a more zoomed out approach at Newcastle's season so far and some of those key data points that we were mentioning. So when it comes to going forwards, they've got the 7th best defensive record in the Premier League with 46 goals scored. They're the 10th best expected offensive record when we're talking about expected goals scored with 47.08. They kind of sit mid-table for their defensive record with 38 goals conceded. And as we already alluded to, they rank mid-table for expected points with 40.01. They're averaging around 1.7 goals per game from an XG of 1.76, averaging 1.41 goals conceded per game with an expected goals against of 1.65. And that bottom stats actually surprised me a little bit. They're only averaging around 49% possession in the Premier League so far. I thought it would be slightly higher than that, given the nature of how they want to play. But again, these Eddie Howe teams is very physically demanding, and you require a lot of energy. You require a lot of physical, emotional, mental kind of shift into a match to be able to play at this high quality, high intensity play style that Eddie Howe wants to do. He is also very flexible in how he wants to play, but look, we know how they're going to set up. It's going to be a 4-3-3, regardless of those personnel changes. They're going to sit with a 4-5-1 block in defense, where their wingers will tuck in and form that five. You'll often see their flat midfield three sit very closely in line, so you won't kind of have a base of the pivot. Rarely, it's normally if you're sitting in a low block in a Newcastle team, or you're sitting in and defending, that middle three of the midfield is going to be in line, and you're going to see that as well. So they're trying to block the lines between the midfield and defense. They're trying to block the channels in between the spaces. And we know when we talk about West Ham playing a back three, which I think we will in this game, and I'll be surprised if we make many changes from the two previous wins that we had against Arsenal and Leicester. That's kind of what we're trying to do. We're trying to force, teams wide with Scarles or Emerson on the left, with Aaron Wan-Bissaka on the right, and create those spaces in the middle. So it's going to be a very difficult test and a very interesting test, because Eddie Howe's going to notice how we want to play, and Potter likewise with Newcastle. And I think the biggest thing with Newcastle is, as I said, they're going to try and negate that space in the middle of the pitch because of that flat midfield three that they'll operate in. And again, coming back into defending a 4-5-1 when they need to, and then looking to capitalize and counter when they can, or press in the right moments. But I think we're going to have to be very, very careful how we approach this, because again, against Leicester, we could probably afford to be a little bit more ambitious, and leave those spaces behind at times, because Leicester just lack the quality to hurt us. Newcastle have the quality to hurt us, regardless of the injuries that they have. So it's going to be an interesting battle there as well. And that physical battle in midfield, how often do we now associate a Newcastle team with being a really big physical unit? The likes of Joe Linton, Bruno Guimaraes as well, a very physical player. So they have physicality throughout their squad. We're going to have to match that, and we're going to have to beat them in that as well, because that's another aspect that Newcastle are going to try and implement on West Ham on Monday night. But when we're talking about West Ham, as I mentioned there, we've got Kudus and Bowen. They were kind of playing as the front two in our last two games. We'd probably expect it to be the same. And again, we'd probably have a midfield three of our own, with Souček, Ward-Prowse, Alvarez. So it's basically going to be a 3-3 matchup in the middle of the park. But then you're looking at Kudus and Bowen to come and drop in and find those gaps between the midfield line and defence line. It's either going to work for West Ham really well, or it's going to not work very well for West Ham. And I think Newcastle they won't be naive to that situation of how we're going to play and where the dangers are, because Kudus and Bowen are arguably West Ham's two biggest threats in this current team. Maybe bar Wan-Bissaka, who's been fantastic for us as well from an attacking perspective and a defensive perspective. But I think Kudus and Bowen, I think that's what Newcastle need to stop. It sounds obvious, but it is true, especially as I mentioned, the way Newcastle are going to play and the way West Ham want to play. It's going to fall into that situation where Kudus and Bowen are going to try and find those spaces. But if Newcastle play in that tight structure, as I just mentioned, it's going to be very difficult for us to find those spaces unless it's in transition, or unless we're playing some fantastic passes through. I think against Leicester, we often lacked that intensity. I think it was a safe and assured performance at times, but it was also risky at times. But in spirit, it was quite passive. It was quite passive in possession. There was few moments of energy kind of injected into that starting 11, or within that 90-minute period. But when we did, we got the goals from it, as we showed in the review show last week. So we're going to need the likes of Souček, Alvarez, Ward-Prowse. We're going to need them to be buzzing in that midfield. We're going to need them to be winning their individual duels against a really good technical and physical midfield Newcastle team. So when we look at who could potentially be absent for this game, we've got this. I think this is probably going to change now based off the comments we've just seen. But Fulcrook, Somerville, we know they're out. Antonio, we know's out. But Paqueta and Kufal could potentially be back in the squad, as they've been pictured in training. When we look at Newcastle, Isak as well, another one that's been training. So I reckon he's 50-50. Whether they're going to risk him for this game with the cup competition final coming up, that's another question. Gordon's suspended, so he won't be able to play. Hall's injured. Botman's injured. Trippier's likely to be injured, and Lascelles is likely to be injured. So, you look at Isak, Gordon, Botman, they've got Lewis Hall, has been fantastic for Newcastle. They have got some key injuries, but they do also have quality to come into the side. But it definitely hurts them. It's definitely a weaker Newcastle team. And as I was mentioning before, this is probably one of the best times to play Newcastle, given the context of the season. But I'm not massively confident for it because Newcastle are a fantastic team, and it would be a miracle for West Ham to win 3 games in a row in the Premier League. But it's not that far fetched that we do get 3 points from this. I think with, as I mentioned again, the context of the situation, there's no reason we can't win this game. As I mentioned before as well, Kudus and Bowen are going to be integral to that. The midfield battle is going to be huge. I do think that when we're looking at the isolating Newcastle in wide areas, that's also a potential avenue to hurt them, especially as the game goes on. But I just think we need to be careful. But if Gordon's missing, that's a huge threat missing from their counter. I know they'll bring in someone like Harvey Barnes, but it's still not the same type of threat. If Isak's playing, we're going to have to be very, very careful of that. And the back three of Todibo, Kilman, and Cresswell are going to have to be on it. And it's likely to be someone like Jacob Murphy on the other side for Newcastle on the right-hand side. So there's still quality in that front three, regardless of what issues they've got. They do have the quality to hurt us, and we can't go into this match thinking that we're going to breeze past this Newcastle team given the context. That is not going to happen. So it's going to be, an interesting tactical battle between these two teams because, as we saw, Newcastle, they're kind of sitting mid-table for their defensive record. West Ham are way below that, near the bottom, but neither side have been fantastic this season. That's kind of the main picture. West Ham absolutely haven't been. We're trying to change that now with Graham Potter. Eddie Howe definitely came under some criticism early on in the season. He's now started to turn that round. Newcastle have pushed up the table and they're now in the final. So there is nuances to it, but I do think in large this is going to be a very interesting game. I think it's going to be quite high energy to start with if I was to predict it from both teams. I think it will be a little bit scrappy at times in that midfield, and I think we'll try and make it scrappy because I think when you look at Newcastle's technical players, the likes of Tonali, Bruno, they do have players that can hurt us with passes through the middle. Isak, if he's playing, he's got the technical quality up front as well. So we're going to have to make it a little bit physical at times and try and bully this Newcastle team who you would so many times you would associate as being the bully in a match. So yeah, in terms of my predictions for the game, I want to remain confident. I want to remain, positive about the situation we find ourselves in. I'm going to go with a 2-1 West Ham win. Again, context is key here. Newcastle, I think if Newcastle fans were offered losing this game and then winning the final, they would absolutely take your hand off of that. But they have ambitions of their own in the Premier League. They're not going to just rest on their laurels in that case. But I do think it is a distraction that plays on your mind as a footballer. This is the last game for them before that final. You as a player don't want to get injured. You don't want to be committing to things that could potentially jeopardize your place in that final. But that's the nature of football. And Premier League is a really competitive nature, and we're not going to make it easy for them, hopefully. And Newcastle aren't going to make it easy for us, that's for certain. So, yeah, I'm going to stay with a 2-1 win. I think we have the quality in this game to get those goals. I think Newcastle equally have that quality. So, yeah, the first goal is going to be so key for West Ham. I think when we go ahead in matches in this Graham Potter system, it really does allow us that flexibility to hit teams on the break with Kudus and Bowen, maybe drop 5 yards deeper in certain situations and let teams have the ball. And, especially being at home, the emphasis is then on the away teams to come out of their shell a little bit. And, the space is then open. Again, it's all common sense stuff, but it's true. And it happens so many times. So, yeah, this is going to be an interesting battle. Let me know down below in the comments section. What do you think is going to happen in this game? Because it is very difficult to predict. I'm going with a 2-1 win because I'm staying positive and, I want us to keep the momentum going in this season. But equally, I can see it being a draw. I can see it being a loss to West Ham at the same time as well. So it's a really difficult one to predict. And it depends what Newcastle turn up, as I said, with the injuries and also the context of where they are at in their season. So, yeah, let me know down below in the comments. What are your thoughts on the game? What are your thoughts on West Ham going into this as well? Because that's the most important thing. How do we assess what success is now for West Ham from now until the end of the season? We've said it's almost like a mini pre-season, and this is a chance for players to step up. So, yeah, I think I'll be surprised if the lineups change. I think we'll stick with the same lineup, even if Paqueta's back in the squad and fit. I don't think Graham Potter will want to change a winning team. So yeah, let me know what your predicted lineups, scores are for this game. And yeah, hopefully we can get the 3 points on Monday night and take the momentum going forwards. And yeah, make it 3 wins from 3 in the Premier League for the first time in I do not remember how long supporting West Ham. So yeah, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more content. And until the next one, come on, you Irons.